let's get back to the serious stuff. Last time I talked about hoarders, King Leopold II, exploitation, mummies eating practices,
colonialism of Congo, stolen artifacts, and art.
And today I want to talk about more. The museum doesn't only have these pictures that show the exploitation of kids in these mines for cobalt and other minerals. It also has a huge collection of minerals. Entire rooms dedicated to minerals of all sorts,
More or less stolen.
under these beautiful glasses. So many sparkly and shiny things. Maybe European colonizers had some kind of genetic mutation that made them act like raccoons or decorator crabs, and I mean it as in being obsessed with shiny things. But what I didn't mention in my last video is that this building was essentially a propaganda flex from Leopold II. He used the 1897 World's Fair in Brussels as a glorified excuse to build this place.
He needed more investors for his future colonial projects.
Now in this century, most politicians would be extremely embarrassed to ever think of something like this, but at the time he wanted to flex on
All the powerful leaders and countries.
show his collection and all the things that his country has gained from the colonies. There were also some amazing family-friendly events like human zoos where you could see
Kidnapped and enslaved Congolese people.
in mock-up villages exactly like a theme park. You could also buy amazing merch.
To remember this beautiful experience.
But now let's talk about the structure. Does it surprise you if I say that it's a neoclassic?
I mean the old part, not the new part that was built in 2018.
Many politicians seem to have a soft spot for neoclassical architecture. But why do they?
First reason,
It's the aesthetic conservatism. From Napoleon to fascists, so many oppressive regimes.
love the new classic.
It's a safe style that recalls a mythical past.
Because we all know that the past was better.
And the risk with new architectural movements is that they might come from women and non-white people.
Second reason,
Neoclassic is flashy, expensive, requires a lot of lavish materials like marble.
imported exotic woods, and even gold for the ornamental details and decorations. Fancy schmancy.
Third reason
New classical architecture,
is big, is imposing.
and in my opinion, compensating for something.
It follows rigid symmetrical rules that are meant to evoke a sense of intimidation in the viewers. If you don't feel small, you must be Godzilla. Fourth reason, neoclassical architecture is white, mainly because of the materials used, like marble, that are white-ish looking. Maybe because in this century is often associated with white supremacists, and the inspo is like ancient Roman / Latin Greek art that right now is white, but we know for sure that used to be colorful in the past. If only these politicians knew. Maybe in an alternative universe, all the neoclassical buildings are super colorful.
We love colors! But now back to the museum.
There is a quite extensive collection of
Taxidermies of animals, even endangered ones.
like the African forest elephant and the okapi. And I know what you're thinking, it does look like an animal designed by some high fashion designer like
Rick Owens.
inside and outside of the museum, sometimes even placed right near the artifacts. There are also a lot of contemporary artworks commissioned by the museum. Some of these artworks replaced the spot of older,
Offensive colonial statues.
but is it truly a good idea to remove or replace an old offensive colonial statue inside an ethnographic museum? It's one of those debates that started at the end of last century
With the post-colonial era,
and it's still fresh even till these days. What should museums and spaces do? Some say that removing the statues might risk erasing history. Others argue that just by existing, the statues glorify colonial figures, promote racist ideologies, and even
reinforce already harmful narratives.
maybe we should do like Hungary and make a garden dedicated only to unwanted statues.
A refugee camp for statues.
In 1992, artist and curator Fred Wilson had to deal with the same problem, and rather than making a new complete project,
At the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore.
he decided to rearrange what the museum already had.
Collection of racist,
Offensive old statues for his project called Mining the Museum. And he also put some funny tags.
near the new rearranged artworks.
I love it.
Another super interesting section of the museum was the part dedicated to the propaganda films and movies. There were two main, very distinctive types of movies. The one for the colonized and one for the colonizers. And two were not interchangeable. The films for the colonized were meant to portray the colonizers as
benevolent,
as perfect human beings.
who have this mission to civilize the colonized. This form of propaganda movies were meant to be perceived as educational.
While on the other hand, the films that were meant for the Europeans and internationals were often action movies in which the role of the colonizers was glorified, while Africa was portrayed as an exotic place full of adventure that required the European intervention to be civilized. The role of the Europeans was romanticized and they were shown as explorers.
While in reality there was a lot of violence and a lot of exploitation happening.
But these movies never showed this kind of things and portrayed the colonizers as these white saviors
In this parallel universe that was Africa.
The movies for the European audience were also relying heavily on
Stereotypes,
and exaggerated portrayals of African cultures.
they didn't really care at all about the accuracy, they just exaggerated everything, reinforcing this colonial ideology.
While using costumes and prompts that were designed to evoke a sense of mystery and wildness.
As je ne sais quoi that needs to be tamed.
There was also a lot of censorship and certain themes were illegal, like any movies talking about
Law between races or corruption.
or insurrection or showing white people as the bad ones, or any movie showing black people having a luxurious life, but also showing the inequality, the racism, the poverty and unemployment was also prohibited. However, some movies still slipped past the administration and were broadcasted secretly. Another interesting part in the museum was called Landscape and Biodiversity, in which the museum, with the use of a very contemporary setting with screens and RGB lights, talked about the current situation in Congo and some African countries. There was a big focus on the rich biodiversity, from the rainforests to the savanna and the wetlands, and the challenges such as the deforestation, the mining and exploitation that are still happening these days, the problem of the
Environmental degradation related to the oil and gas extraction.
There were all these screens and projections with data and visual information about the deforestation rates and the loss of biodiversity.
And how it's impacting the climate.
There was a big emphasis on the new technologies that are used now to monitor the forests and protect the wildlife, and how we can improve sustainability.
And the many international projects working on that.
There was a part in the museum also dedicated to
Food security, the agriculture and fishing techniques that are used in the different parts of Africa and Congo specifically.
And close to the end, there was also a part dedicated to the representation of black culture that I almost had to rush through.
Because even though I spent so many hours in the museum, there were not enough.
The section was putting a lot of emphasis on the representation in music and art and pop culture, showing the different African identities and how they are expressed today, and how contemporary art is affected by the legacy of colonialism, and how many music genres that are popular today come from histories, resistance and
Adaptation.
that are influenced by colonialism, by migration and by the resilience of marginalized communities. And I think it's important to keep talking about the contributions of black people and African people to history, because the systemic racism and the injustice still persists today. The museum also talks about the civil rights movements, and even the most recent one, like the Black Lives Matter, because even these days, there's still a lot that needs to change. Black people in Europe and in other parts of the world have to deal with systemic barriers, like employment and housing discriminations,
I saw those housing posts on Facebook in which the landlord would write, I don't want any Africans.
or institutional racism. For example, when the Anagraphic Office rejects a name because it considers it foreign and unusual.
Don't tell Elon Musk. The racism had only been increasing in Europe in these last years, and I think that is problematic.
Those same racist roots that once were used to justify the slave trade are the same toxic ideas that are just now resurfacing in this modern era in different ways. But now, paraphrasing Gabe, it is not the fascism that terrifies me, but the fascist inside of us. What I want to say is that racism is not just a political phenomenon, but also a cultural attitude that is widespread in society. It's in the small things, the hidden things of everyday life, embedded in the language and social dynamics. It's microaggressions, stereotypes, and implicit denial of opportunities. The real danger is when it becomes normal, visible to those who perpetuate it.